Welcome to part 5 of this JSL Decoded video series. Let me just remind you where we are. In the last video we created a script that we put a lot of error handling in, but fundamentally the script presents a list of variables and I select one. Once it's selected, it becomes the X variable on a graph. I want to change this dialog. So currently we have a very sort of custom dialog, and I want to change it to be something which is much more familiar. I want to use a dialog that looks something more like a traditional dialog that JMP uses for column selection. So in fact I'm going to keep this window here for reference purposes, and I'm going to create a totally new script, and this script is going to prototype the code that we need to produce the window. And then in a future video, probably in tomorrow's video, we'll look at integrating this code within the existing example JSL script. So let me start off by just saying that names default to here. First thing that we want to do is to create a custom window. I'll give the name column selection. Now, what's going to go inside this window? If you look at the example window that we have a section here called Select Columns, and that is known as a panel box. We then have a second panel box, Cast Selected Columns into Rows. Now these two are organized horizontally with respect to each other, so I'm going to put them inside an H-list box. Like so. Above those there is a text that says model the relationship between two variables. So we're going to put our own text message in here. Maybe a select response variable and predictor variables. Now that text box is aligned vertically with respect to our panel boxes. So I'm going to put that inside the list box. So that's the broad structure. It's worth just running this to make sure it works correctly. What we're really looking for is to make sure there's no errors that occur. So for example, if you had forgotten to include this comma, you'll get an error. So we're going to constantly run the script just to verify that we're not getting any errors, that we haven't forgotten a closing bracket or a comma, and also just to get a feel for the layout. So what I would like to do with this is maybe just put some margins in place. I'm going to put everything inside a border box. And I'm also going to put a margin between the two panel boxes. And all of these numbers are in pixels. So I've got a 10 pixel space between the two panel boxes. Let me run this now. And that's looking good. Okay, so let's focus on this panel box here, selected columns. And you see in JMP we have a list of columns. And this structure here is known as a filter column selector. So I'm going to put that inside the panel box. So the first argument for the panel box is the title, and the second argument is the content. So this is going to be a filter Col Selector. so. If I run this now, JMP does the hard work and populates this with the list of the columns for the current data table. Now let's focus on the right hand side. We have pairs of buttons and lists. So button and corresponding list, button and corresponding list. So let's focus on the first pair. So this button here for the response and the list of responses. So this comes into the second panel box. And the button and the list are organized horizontally. So let me put an H list box in straight away. And we have a button box, and that is a Y response. And then we have what's called a Col List Box. So let me just run this and show you what that looks like. That needs open and close brackets. Okay, so that's looking good. I'm going to do a cosmetic change with respect to the button. I'm going to make the button a bit wider just by putting a couple of spaces either side of the title. And I'm also going to maybe put a little bit of a space between the button and this column list box. Just 6 pixels, like so. So I'm happy with that layout. The next thing to consider is that I don't want to have a long list of responses. I only want a single response. So there are some keywords that we can associate with this column list box. Now, I never remember the keywords, so at this point the scripting index is going to be my friend. The scripting index organizes content by topics. So we have different categories. We want the display boxes, and within here we can find the column list box. There's lots of different keywords. The ones I'm interested in were the number of lines. I want only a single line for it, and that's because the maximum number of items that I want is going to be 1. And actually I also want to fix the minimum number. I want to suggest, at the moment if you run this, it says optional. Well, I don't want it to be optional. What I want it to be is, first of all, a numeric value, and the max number of items is just 1, but also the minimum number of items is 1. So that changes the behavior. So now it says it's required and it must be numeric. And although I've said a maximum number of items, I still need to sort of say how many lines associated with it. So number of lines 1. So that looks good. There's a slight misalignment here in terms of their vertical positioning. So I'm just going to say that this H list box, I want to align the content within there to be centered. That should just fix the issue. And that's looking better now. Okay, excellent. So I have my first pair of buttons, so my button and my list. I now can duplicate that code for the X variables. So this H list box, let's put a comma there. Well, I'll put the comma in a moment. Let's just copy the whole thing. There's the H list box, and we're going to copy it and then separate them with a comma. The second button can say X and predictors. The Col List Box, it doesn't have to be numeric. I don't mind the data type for this. And the maximum number of items, I'm not limiting. But I do want at least 1. And number of lines, maybe, let's have 9 lines and see what that looks like. So that looks pretty good. I don't like this. This is because this button's been center aligned. It made sense for the Y but not the X. So let me remove the center alignment on this H list box and run this again. And that looks pretty good. Maybe we could put a bit of a space between these two. So let's, between those H list boxes, let's just put 10 pixels and see what that looks like. Yeah, I think that's maybe a bit cleaner. I'm going to maybe just make this list a bit shorter so it's similar size. So maybe just have this a size 8. But that's looking good. So what do we need to do next? Let's just take a look at this and decide. I think the next thing is just to focus on the functionality now. So let's see what works. Well, you can drag a response onto here, and you can't put name on because it has to be numeric. I can put a list of responses in here. And if I want to remove, I can double click to remove something, or I select and press delete. So we can add and remove these, but the buttons don't work. If I select this and click the button, nothing happens. So we're going to focus on getting the buttons to do what they're supposed to be doing. So let's look at the Y button first of all. That's this button here. Then the first argument is the name that goes on the button. I can put a comma and press enter, and I can write a script in here. And what is the script going to do? It's going to look at what's been selected from this object, and it then is going to add it to the contents of this list. So to reference these, we need to give them names. So I'm going to call this FCS, Filter Column Selector, and I'm going to call this CLB, Column List Box. I've got 2 of these. This is the one for the Y's, and this is the one for the X's. Okay, so now let me come to my button definition. I want to take FCS, and I want to get whatever's been selected. And I need to reference those, call it a cell. And then what I can do is I can take the CLBY and I can append whatever's been selected. Let's make sure that works. I select Oxy, click the button, and that works. So I can take the same logic now and add it to the button for the X's. The only difference is this needs to be CLBX. So if I select a list of columns, click the button, everything works perfectly. So that's excellent. So now my buttons are working. What else do we have? Well, the next thing to do is unload the contents from this form. So ultimately, we are generating a list. Let's call it just list X. In fact, let me show. I want to show list X and list Y. These are going to be the lists of X's and Y's that are being selected on the form. Now, the easiest way to do this is to say that this window is going to be a modal window. What that does is to force the user to respond before we get to this point of code. And then what we can do is say, well, this window, well, let's first of all show you what happens. If I run the script, you see we have an OK button. So the user does the selections, and then we click the OK button. Once we click the OK button, the form closes. Now I'm getting an error because list X and list Y are unresolved at this stage, so those aren't defined. So we need to define them. Now, when we click OK, we close the window, or jump closes the window, and we have what's known as an onClose event. And we can write some code that handles that event. So here I can say list X is going to equal whatever's been assigned to this column list box, which is CLBX. So I can say CLBX, and I can say get items. Similarly, make a copy of that. I can, for the Y variable, CLBY. So now I've defined list X and list Y. It gets defined at the point where the window closes. Let's run this. So those are the column assignments. I click OK. And this should have got executed. We will see it if I view the log. And you see that these have been assigned. To make this easier, what we'll do is we'll right click on the script and we'll embed the log and we'll see this information. Let me just run this again. And that's the information being displayed. Okay, let's now consider what can go wrong with this. Well, if I run this, the user has the option of cancelling this window, in which case these are empty. Now, I like to explicitly capture this event. The way to do that is to give the window a name, NW, and when we close the window, we can test. So we can say if NW, and we reference the button object, which is the OK button effectively, and if we get a value of -1, that means the user has just cancelled from the window. So basically say if this quantity is equal to -1, we throw an error, we cancel execution. And so we never come to this point. So if I run cancel, we never show these values. The other thing that could happen is we run and just click OK. So we're not cancelling, but we've not put anything in. And although it says required, this is not enforced. This is just an indication to the user that you're supposed to put these values in. But Jump doesn't enforce it, and we end up with empty lists. So I'm just going to, now we could do some validation around that, but I think it's sufficient and a lot easier just to do this. I'm going to say if the number of items in list X is equal to 0, we're also going to throw an error. And I'll do the same. So either the user has cancelled explicitly, or they just haven't bothered to fully specify the problem. If any of those events occur, we're just aborting execution. So now if I just click OK, nothing happens. Let's compare what we have built versus what we have on the left-hand side here. The only difference in terms of functionality, we don't have a remove button, but you can remove either by selecting something and pressing delete or by double clicking. So we do have remove functionality. We don't have a cancel button, but you can cancel by clicking on the X, so that's fine. The only other piece of functionality which I think really adds a lot of value to the user experience is the recall button. So I do want to implement a recall button. And so I need to think about where to put it, and I think I'm just going to put it here. So it's not quite the same design as what Jump has, but that's because with a modal window, Jump's put this in place for us. So I'm going to put a recall button there. So it's underneath the X predictors button. So let's find that button. Here's the X predictors button. That's the start of the definition. Here's the end. So below there, I'm going to have another button box called recall. And I want some space between those two buttons, maybe 20 pixels. And those buttons are going to be aligned vertically. So I'm going to put a V-list box in here and make sure I have that button selected, the spacer box and that button. They all go inside my V-list box, like so. Let's see how that looks. Pretty good, but I want to get this button wider so they're all the same sort of width. So I just need to put some extra spaces in here, I think. We'll get there in the end. That looks good. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. If we really want to be pixel perfect, this button's slightly longer than this. So I can either make that shorter, or let's make the Y a bit longer. may as well get this as perfect as possible. Probably only needed one on that. Okay, those two buttons are the same. Now let's make this a wee bit wider by having an extra space at the end. I think that will keep me happy. Okay, that's excellent. So now what we want to happen is when we click on the recall button, we want to recall the values that have been stored in list X and list Y. Now the problem is list X and list Y only exist for the duration that this script is running, because we put names default to here. So if I run the script again, those variables no longer exist. So I can't recall them because they are not defined. So what I need to do is to create a piece of memory. I need to store this information in a box and put that box in memory and give it a name. And that's known as a namespace. So I'm going to give it a name, recall, and recall in relation to our example JSL script. And I'm the author, so let's make sure it's an absolutely unique name here. So that's my namespace. I need a variable to reference it. I'll call it NSRecall, like so. Now, that namespace doesn't exist. I can't reference something that doesn't exist. So I have to first of all ask the question, if namespace exists, and what namespace? Well, it's this thing. If this thing exists, if a namespace with this name exists, then I can get a reference to it. Otherwise, else, we have to create a new one. So we're going to say new namespace. So let's just go through that. If the namespace exists, then reference that namespace and store it in this variable. Else, it doesn't exist, so we create a new namespace and store it in that variable. And not only that, when we create it first time round, we will put a couple of variables in there. List X, which is an empty list, and list Y, which is an empty list. And at the very end of our script, what we will do is these values will get stored. So I can say NSRecall. I'm going to list X. So what are we doing? We're taking the contents of this list and we're storing it in a new variable, which is this variable here, which is actually, this could be a totally different name. I could call that just list. So that's this totally different variable, but I want to have a list X, and that's because we're going to have a list Y as well. So I've got my list Y and list Y. So hopefully that makes sense. We're making a copy of these lists. We're putting these lists into a box, and that box is a namespace. But the key thing is that namespace exists and has persisted even after the script is finished. Okay, so let's just take that. Now, we can now reference this information using the recall button. So if I come up, we have the recall button here. So let's put a comma in here and a space. And here I can reference the namespace. But first of all, I have to create this variable again. So I'm going to take that line. That's a reference to the namespace. Make sure you take namespace, not new namespace. You don't want to create a new namespace at this point. So I'm going to paste it there. So I've got a reference to the namespace. So that's a reference to the box. And now what I can do is I can get access to the variables in the box. And what are we going to do with them? Well, I want to recall list Y, and I want to put it into here. So I can say CLB Y, set items to be NSRecall list Y. Let's see if that works. So first time round, the namespace doesn't exist. So let me do something so that next time you run this, there's something to recall. Press recall and I get the value. Perfect. And I can now do the same. That's the Y values. And now do the X values. And let's run this. click recall, and it's recalled the X value. So that's perfect. And this really enhances the user experience. It also helps you when you're testing, because every time you run this for test purposes, you don't have to keep selecting columns. You just click the recall button. So it's a really nice piece of functionality, and it really isn't that difficult to implement. So I think we now have the completed script. Let's save it and save this as a column dialog prototype. And I'm going to do one final set of testing. So I'm just going to bring up the home window, and I'm just going to run from here. And let's test the error conditions. Let's just click OK. It's fine. Let's just run this and click cancel. That's fine. And now let's actually run and do a proper assignment. Let's make sure we can take everything, including categorical data. Don't want the runtime, sorry, don't want Oxy, that's the response. Click OK. And that should have worked, and we can just verify that in the log. And we correctly have this information coming out on the log. In the next video, we're going to integrate this functionality into the existing script that we've been developing. Hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, please leave those questions in the comments below. All the best, and bye for now.